Hi, I'm going to be reading from Tangerine, Sunday, November 5th, on page 176. Mr. Donnelly called Dad last night, which is funny because Mr. Donnelly had never returned Mom's phone calls or responded to her letter about the row of lightning rods on his roof. Anyway, he called Dad and invited us all over there tonight. Mr. Donnelly, aside from being an old outlaw wanted by the Architectural Committee, is a big University of Florida football booster. He has season tickets, he knows the coach, he even travels to games as far away as Tennessee. Dad has been after him ever since we moved here to come and see Eric kick. Now that Eric is starting to live up to Dad's bragging, Mr. Donnelly has taken notice. After the field goals of 40 and 45 yards in the game against Flagler, he showed up at the practice field and watched Eric make 3 50-yarders in a row. He was impressed. So we're all invited over there to meet 2 other Florida football guys from this area. Dad says, I want coaches from Florida, FSU, and Miami to start hearing about this kid from Lake Windsor High. The kid from Lake Windsor High agrees. Eric is now as famous in these parts as Antoine Thomas. There are even those that say Eric is more important to the team. This hasn't sat well with Antoine and some of the other players. Some of them obviously don't like Eric, but it seems that most of them do. Eric and his flunky Arthur are always in demand. They're in big demand this evening. Arthur picked up Eric about 2 hours ago to go somewhere else. We never know where. And they'll be going somewhere else right after Mr. Donnelly's. You can just imagine Mom's reaction to this visit tonight. She told Dad, I don't care if this is supposed to be about football. He's going to tell me why he won't answer the letter and the phone calls from the Architectural Committee. Dad said, please, tonight is not about that. Tonight is only about Eric. Mom, Dad, and I decided to walk to Mr. Donnelly's. We turned the corner at Kew Gardens Drive just as the sun was setting. The row of lightning rods in the red sky looked like some weird experiment, like NASA's model home on Mars, complete with a for sale sign. Arthur Bauer's muddy Land Cruiser was parked out on the street in front of the house, ready for a quick getaway. I wondered if Eric and Arthur were sitting in there. I stared hard at the tinted glass, but I couldn't see anything inside. Dad must have been wondering the same thing. He started to walk up to the passenger side door, but he never got there. It was when the mosquitoes attacked. I look up into the sun. Mosquitoes completely filled the air above us, hovering, skinny, black, and silent. They glided down onto us like tiny blood-sucking men in parachutes. We all started to slap at ourselves as we felt the first bites. I watched one land on Mom's cheeks. She screamed and started to run. Dad and I hurried after her. At the front door, we brushed at each other frantically until Terry Donnelly opened it. We dove through the door, nearly capsizing a glass trophy case in the foyer. Around the corner in the great room, a videotape of a Florida Gators football game was playing on a big screen TV, and there sat Eric, composed, casual, wearing his football hero smile. He was on a long couch with Mr. Donnelly and 2 other men, who Mr. Donnelly introduced as Larry and Frank. Eric stood up when the others did, like a gentleman would. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. Larry and Frank were smiling. They seemed to like Eric, to be impressed with him, to be ready to support the Eric Fisher football dream in any way they could. Mom looked around and said, So where's Arthur? Eric seemed genuinely surprised by the question. He said, Arthur? He's out in the truck, as if to say, where else would he be? But Mr. Donnelly called over to his son, Terry, go outside and tell that boy to come in. Eric waved at Terry Donnelly and said, Nah, he doesn't want to come in. He smells too much like bug spray. Mom sniffed. Now that you mention it, so do you. Eric pulled his shirt up to his nose and sniffed, too. Bauer always has bug spray in the truck, in case we want to go mud running. Mr. Donnelly said, Yeah, those swamp skeeters will eat you alive. The conversation went on like that for a while. Eric remained charming. Larry and Frank remained impressed. Arthur Bauer remained in the truck. Mr. Donnelly turned out to be a nice guy and a good host. He didn't sit there listening to Eric all night. He talked to Dad about old Charlie Burns and the parties he used to have in his skybox. Then he talked to Mom about the concerns of the Architectural Committee. I drifted back over to that glass trophy case to examine its contents. A lot of it seemed to be rinky-dink stuff that Terry Donnelly won as a kid, but there were a couple of things that belonged to Mr. Donnelly. Suddenly, he was at my elbow saying, I keep my Heisman trophy out in the garage. I laughed, and he continued, Now what about you, Paul? Are you a kicker too? I play soccer, sir. Ah, I suppose you are a kicker. Do you play for Lake Windsor Middle? No, sir, I play for the War Eagles, Tangerine Middle School. He opened his eyes wide. I remember, Betty Bright's team. You have all those all-star girls playing for you, right? Yes, sir. How's your season going? We're number 1. We're undefeated. We're breaking all county scoring records. Mr. Donnelly looked at me with increasing interest. And you're doing all that with a mixed boy-girl team? Yes, sir. He nodded. I've known your coach for a long time. She's an extraordinary person. Does she ever talk about her track career? No, sir. No? Let me tell you, Betty Bright is the greatest track and field athlete to ever come out of this area. She ran the 100-meter dash and the 100-meter hurdles. She threw the discus and the javelin, and she did the high jump and the broad jump. She did it all, right over at Tangerine High. Did she ever play soccer? No, not to my knowledge. She became famous as a hurdler. I mean, really famous. The Times started a fund to send her to the U.S. Olympic track trials back in 1978. She made the team, too. She competed in the Pan Am Games in Buenos Aires the next year. Here, Mr. Donnelly turned to the men who were watching football. Do you guys remember that fun drive we had for Betty Bright? Larry got up and joined us. Sure, she's the runner. The hurdler, Mr. Donnelly corrected him. He turned back to me. I remember Larry and a bunch of us at the newspaper office one Saturday afternoon watching Betty Bright on ABC's Wide World of Sports. You know, the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat. And there she was. It was a great feeling. Our paper had gotten behind her case. And now there she was. Larry interjected. She got punched or something, right? Right. The East German hit her in the eye going over the first hurdle. Betty finished 4th in her heat and didn't qualify to go on. Larry reached his fist over to demonstrate next to my face. This German punched her right here, knocked her off her balance. You could see it on the replay. Mr. Donnelly picked up the story. The U.S. coach protested, but nothing came of it. That was it. She was out of the competition. Larry said, yeah, it was a bad break. Then she ran into the boycott. Right, Mr. Donnelly explained for my benefit. 2 years later, the U.S. boycotted the Olympic Games in Moscow, so none of our athletes got to go. He stopped and stuck a finger in the middle of my chest. But all that aside, Betty Bright was great, and she had a great amateur career. We were proud to have sponsored her. She got a free ride through college out of it. She got scholarship offers from all the big schools. She chose Florida A&M so she could stay close to her family. Mom and Dad and Eric walked up behind Mr. Donnelly. He turned and said, What, you're leaving so soon? Mom smiled. I'm afraid so. Busy, busy, busy. Hey, it was great to meet you, Eric. Mom, Dad, and Eric smiled. And it was great to meet you too, Paul. Mom, Dad, and Eric all pulled back at once, as if in group shock. As if that was the craziest thing they had ever heard. We said a couple more goodbyes and hustled outside, ready to run in case the mosquitoes were still there. They weren't. Eric walked up and opened the passenger side door of the Land Cruiser. I don't think Arthur expected that. He looked up quickly, his eyes wide and startled in the dome light. He scooped something shiny from the dashboard into a plastic bag as Eric closed the door. Then all was dark inside again. The Land Cruiser's engine roared to life and they pulled away. Mom, Dad, and I walked home through the smoky air. We had all come up with things to say to Mr. Donnelly, bright and clever things. But we had nothing left to say to each other. When we got to our house, Dad unlocked his car, reached in, and pressed the garage door opener. The door slid up for us. Just as we reached it, we all ducked inside quickly, but I stopped myself at the kitchen door. I had to stop. I had to look back, because something was nagging at me, troubling me, a memory. Mom called back to me. Will you get the garage door button, please? One of them must have turned on the message machine, because I suddenly heard my grandmother's voice. She said, Caroline, your father and I are talking about taking some vacation time down in Florida. I heard those few words spoken in grandmother's flat voice. I heard them deep inside me. I never heard the rest of her message. I stood still in that garage, staring back out at the driveway, and I remembered. Standing in our garage in Huntsville, staring out at the driveway, Grandmom and Grandpop came walking up. They each carried an overnight bag in one hand. Eric suddenly appeared in the driveway, so they stopped to say hello to him. Mom was standing next to me. I remember her bending over and whispering, Paul, don't say anything bad to your Grandmom and Grandpop. They resumed walking up to where we stood. Grandmom looked at me, then leaned back, as if to see me better, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Grandpop leaned the other way. He bent right over, right in my face, and said, What the hell happened to your eyes? Mom told them, We can talk about it inside. The important thing is he's going to be okay. I remember them all going in, leaving me staring out at that driveway, leaving me to stare out at Eric, who is staring back in at me. Thanks for coming by. Don't forget to like and subscribe.